Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring an unusual, relatively recent phenomenon known as Instrumental Transcommunication, sometimes also known as electronic voice phenomena. With me is Professor Stafford Betty, who is with the Department of Religious Studies at California State University at Bakersfield. Dr. Betty is an authority on questions concerning life after death. He is the author of Heaven and Hell, Unveiled, and also The Afterlife, Unveiled. And most recently, When Did You Ever Become Less by Dying? Welcome, Stafford.
Well, nice to be here. Thank you, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you again. Electronic voice phenomenon, or instrumental transcommunication, it's almost like the conventional form of spiritual mediumship, in the sense that you have ostensible spirits, departed, who are attempting to communicate with the living.
Yes, that is correct. And they're doing it in a way that depends on technology.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to speculate why they would even want to do this. They've been speaking to us through mediums for 150 years at least.
Yeah.
And now they've embarked on something new.
Well, the mediumship research has always been colored by the possibility, not even the possibility, the likelihood, that the mediums themselves are interpreting the messages that they presumably are receiving through their own subconscious minds. So they're adding a little bit.
They are. And we know that that's the case because the spirits who speak through them sometimes complain to their mediums that this is happening.
Yeah.
Get out of the way, they're saying. All right, you're contaminating or coloring the message I'm trying to get across.
Yeah.
It's hard being a good medium.
It's hard being a spirit communicating.
It is.
I gather.
It's both. And a medium has to be adept at shutting out her mind and letting another mind come through her brain. Use it. And it would be nice if there was some other way to do this, some way that skirted the whole issue of coloring or contamination. And I suspect that that is what spirits on the other side are trying to do by working through instruments.
Now, there is a form of mediumship I've heard of called direct voice mediumship, where medium goes into trance, and a spirit voice is heard in the room, but it's not coming through the vocal cords of the medium.
No, but but presumably it's coming through something to do with the medium, maybe the brain of the medium. You're right, and I have not heard anyone say, though, that is an airtight way of avoiding coloration.
There's also, in terms of mediumship communication, there's automatic writing, there's the Ouija board, there are rappings where they hear, 2 raps for yes or 1 rap for no, and messages get communicated that way.
Yeah, and it's some of it is just hard to take seriously. And most educated people don't take it seriously. They hear the word medium and they run in the other direction.
Well, researchers do take it seriously.
They absolutely do.
In psychical research.
And certainly I do too.
Yeah.
And for very good reason. But most people, for example, the university colleagues I have, they look at me as a peculiar kind of a duck. What is this guy? What is he doing with his life, with his professional life? Well, I think that I'm addressing the biggest question that we can as a philosopher. What happens to us, if anything, when we die? And this is a way to find out. It's the only way that I can find that's at all trustworthy. I look at the scriptures and I think, well, they're interesting, but as far as evidence, I don't see it. So, can we bypass the medium and come up with a method of communication that is simply more trustworthy, that might even appeal to an audience that would have nothing to do with mediumship, precisely because it is, precisely because a different path has been followed, the path of technology.
Yes.
And you know, if we can find a way to place voices on electronic tape, or on a television screen, or on a telephone, and it's recorded there for anyone to listen to, for anyone to view, it's there, then that would be a step in the right direction. And I think that we here in our world recognize that that would be a tremendous advantage. And interestingly, it appears that the spirits on the other side also feel that that would be an advantage to get their message across, namely that their world is real, and that's the world that we're going to go to when we die.
Well, that's a profound message, and of course, naturally, there's going to be a lot of skepticism and resistance to a message of that sort, and yet now we have this new field of ITC, as it's sometimes called, Instrumental Transcommunication, or EVP for electronic voice phenomenon, where people often use radios.
Right. That's exactly right. That's the standard way to conduct EVP, electronic voice phenomena. And it was discovered back around 1960. A very important book was written by Konstantin Raudiva, I believe is the way you pronounce his name, called Breakthrough.
Yes.
And he, along with other Europeans, had developed this science to a certain extent and had begun to figure out a way, they had succeeded in figuring out a way to bring these spirits to them and to record their voices on tape. And eventually to make it possible for them to speak right outside, right out into the open through a radio. The way you do this, and this is so strange, you know, you first read about it and you think, oh, this can't be. That was my reaction 30 years ago when I read this. Now I've looked into it, and it's very real, and it's important. You set your dial between a couple of stations on the radio. You set it to a station where no one is broadcasting.
So that you're getting white noise.
You're getting white noise, or this kind of hiss sound.
Staticky.
Static hiss, is sometimes it's called. And you invite anyone from the other side who is interested to break through that noise and leave a message. Okay? And there have been any number of successes, and we'll be listening to one in just a moment.
We should point out that this has become a hobby or an avocation now for thousands of amateurs.
All around the world. Tens of thousands of people around the world.
Tens of thousands of people.
Absolutely.
There's even a journal.
Right, there is. But there are also some real pros. And we'll be looking at probably, yes, I think we can say without exception that she is the most prominent living researcher in this field. That's Annabella Cardoso. She's a Portuguese diplomat, a person of high integrity and considerable esteem, who does this as kind of a hobby. Actually, it's now that she's retired, it's become mainly her life. And she records these voices. She's become extremely good at getting voices to speak to her.
As I recall, she's one of the founders of the Journal of Instrumental Transcommunication.
Yes, indeed. So we'll be hearing more about her in just a moment. But that's the background. Now, there are other ways for spirits to come to us. One of them is through telephone. And there was a book published not too long ago, I forget by whom, you may remember, called Telephone Calls from the Dead.
Well, my cousin, Scott Rogo, wrote a book called Phone Calls from the Dead back in the 1970s.
Right, and I think we've had another one with a title similar to that.
That's right.
Was it by Cal Cooper? I forget. I'm not sure. Who have brought together cases of people picking up their phone after it's rung and hearing a message from a deceased loved one.
Well, you know, I had an experience akin
Okay.
to that, I'll tell you. I had a dear friend who was a researcher, a parapsychology researcher, Elizabeth Targ, the daughter of Russell Targ.
Oh, yeah.
She died. It was a very sad death of glioblastoma, a brain tumor. She was in her 40s, a beautiful, talented woman. And after her death, she began appearing through different mediums. It was quite an extensive trail of communications from her. And one night, I had a dream. I was hearing about the various communications. And in the dream, she came to me. And it felt like real. It didn't feel like a dream. I said to her, "Oh, Elizabeth, it's so nice to be with you again. I have been hearing such interesting things about your communications." and I said, in particular, the physical events that accompany some of your communications. This was in my dream. At that very moment, I was awakened. The phone rang. And I reached over, I had the phone next to my bed in those days, reached over, I picked up the phone, and there was nothing but white noise.
No.
Yeah.
That is amazing.
Yeah, that happened to me.
How about that? Well, that's one of the three main ways that ITC is manifesting itself. Phone calls, more prominently and much more frequently, this radio style of communication. That's where most of the excitement is today. But also, increasingly, there are appearances on television sets.
I have even heard when the television set is unplugged.
That's right. Yeah, as a matter of fact, if someone is coming through on the radio, has broken through the hiss, and is communicating, having a conversation with Cardoso, for example, if she were to pull the plug out of the radio, the communication would continue. It has nothing to do with the electricity that we get from except the setup of the white noise. That's all that's necessary to start it. But once it starts, once the voice breaks through with that advantage, then you can unplug it. That's amazing. Right. So we're dealing with something quite mysterious.
Now, some of our viewers may hear funny sounds in the background as we're speaking right now, and I just want to say, I normally don't mention this, but there's a truck outside making some noise. So if you're hearing funny sounds in the background, it is not ITC or EVP.
That's good. All right. Good. Okay. Actually, recently there have been instances of vague pictures of the afterworld that are turning up occasionally on television sets.
Yes.
And so that's a third form, and that's why we have to use the word ITC, Instrumental Transcommunication. It's no longer just EVP.
Not just voices, it's
not
pictures.
Not just voices, but it's pictures now. And that's why we've had to dump the old word and use this newer word.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the background of it, Jeff. And
well, why don't we'll play the tape that we have from Annabella Cardoso's collection. This is a voice in Portuguese.
It's in Portuguese, and it is a voice that comes directly through the radio speaker. It is not, I should mention in passing that more often than not, and at the beginning, this was the only way the voices ever came. They came through a tape recorder, which was placed right next to the radio.
In other words, you couldn't hear them if you were listening just to the radio.
You could not.
Only when you play back the tape.
Only when you play back the tape would you be able to hear the voices.
Yeah.
But after 2 months, Cardoso had a breakthrough, totally unexpected, and wacko, all of a sudden the voices started coming directly out of the radio and bypassed the tape.
And also, she was able to engage in two-way conversation.
Oh, yes.
It wasn't just a question of hearing an occasional voice.
Exactly right. And what we're about to hear now is one of those instances. Jeff, can you play it?
Yeah, we'll play it now.
Good. Yeah, it says, first of all, there's a reference to he. He does not come. That's probably a reference to her father, who did sometimes come. He does not come, but I come down to my group. I go to the soul It is the edifice of the tempo. Now,
that is the English translation of what she believes she heard in Portuguese.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you saw the acoustical quality
and her voice is also there on that recording because she's trying to converse with him.
And in fact, she does succeed in conversing with him, but we don't hear that on this particular tape.
Yeah.
We hear her voice in the background just a little bit.
Yeah.
In any case, that's what that says. Now, what she is saying here is that she has come down to a transmitting station, the otherworldly transmitting station called Rio do Tempo.
Mm-hmm.
So when she says
time stream,
time stream
would be an English translation.
Exactly.
But the implication here is that there's some form of technology on the other side, these transmitting stations where spiritual beings on the other side, when they wish to communicate this way, they need to go there.
They do. And we know this. We found this out through Raudeva. Raudeva was the person in his book Breakthrough. He discovered that fact. It astonished him that there would be any need of some kind of technology on the other side, a transmitting station that spirits who wanted to speak to us had to go to. What a strange, unexpected situation. But it was a consistent revelation coming from the voices. And this is a reference to the most prominent of all of those stations called Rio do Tempo. It is the edifice of the tempo. So this communicator, Carlos de Almeida, has to go.
A regular communicator. She recognized that voice over and over again.
Exactly, the same voice. And he is saying that he had to go to the station in order to communicate. That's what this means.
Now, I think it's fair to say that a skeptical person would not find this all that convincing by itself, especially at first, because those voices are very often hard to recognize.
Right. Well, they would not be so hard to recognize if you spoke Portuguese. You'd be able to hear this muffled sound and make it out clear enough to come up with this translation. And they would be hard-pressed, the skeptics would be hard-pressed to explain how those voices managed to assert themselves in that, out of that radio.
Well, skeptics have an easy way to sort of brush away all the unpleasant evidence, and
you're going to tell it to me now.
Well, just brush it under the rug and say, until we have a computer voice recognition program that can translate it perfectly every time, I'm not going to pay attention to it.
Right. That is to follow the example of the ostrich, in my opinion. But nevertheless, that is exactly what they would say.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that, as we pointed out in an earlier interview, there may be a dozen avenues of evidence pointing to the afterlife. Any single one of them will be problematic.
That's right. Some more than others. And probably this would be one that would be more than others. I quite agree with you. One of the more interesting contentions by some speculative people who are at least not opposed to this kind of approach to communication from the other side is that actually it might well be that who is coming through are aliens. And this is interesting because Cardoso herself believes in aliens. And the reason she believes in them is that she was told by her communicators that there are such things as aliens. And so it's conceivable that all of this comes from aliens and not from dead people on the other side.
Aliens who are pretending to be dead people.
That's exactly right.
Or as a fundamentalist Christian might say, demons.
Right. What's interesting is that in any number of these communications, the claim has been made by whoever the voices are that they are dead people. They say over and over again, we are the dead people. We are your aunt. We are your uncle. And because she is dealing with people whom she recognizes, not just with voices who happen to tumble out of the radio, but people whom she knows.
And whose voices are recognizable.
They're recognizable.
Although I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that when you subject these signals to electronic analysis, they don't look just like normal human vocal cord productions.
They don't. As you were saying, showing me earlier, they certainly don't. That could be explained in a number of ways. I would think the most obvious way would be to say, well, it's coming from another world. You know, it's coming from the afterlife. We wouldn't expect the voices to be quite the same. But that is one of the, Cardoso puts aside this objection, and she does it in this way. She says, the advice that she's getting from these voices is very high-minded. It's ethically advanced. And it would be a very strange thing if these aliens were lying about who they were, given how ethically advanced they seem to be. Why would they do that? Why would they want to pretend to the rest of the world that they were dead people rather than who they were? In any case, I think that's a bit of a stretch. It seems to me that we can dismiss that with some degree of confidence. Much more likely that they are what they tell us they are. That is to say, the voices of dead people.
Well, I think what's really intriguing to me about Annabella Cardoso's work is that a very well-known psychical researcher, David Fontana, the author of books about the afterlife and former president, as I recall, of the Society for Psychical Research, spent some time investigating her claims.
He did.
So he's an really objective observer.
Right. What he did, this is interesting, he befriended Cardoso, and he was invited to her home, I believe it was in northwestern Spain at the time. She also spent time as an ambassador in Paris, so she went back and forth. I believe this was in Spain, and he was invited there. He was given the run of the house. He didn't have to, he just made it his own. He could go down into the basement and work with the radios at any point. He could be an observer. In other words, she wanted him to be absolutely sure that there was no fraud involved whatsoever. And that's what he did. He took full advantage of that. And he discovered that voices would start blurting out in the night from the studio through the radio. And he would go down and check it out. And, of course, there was nobody around. And there was no reason to expect him even to hear these voices. It's just that the voices were ready to speak and hope that they would be heard. They were not. And
the equipment was left on.
It was left on, and so it was. He never suspected for 1 minute that there was anything about her character that would lead anyone to think there was fraud. But he felt like, as a researcher, he had to check it out, and she passed, all of these tests in flying colors.
Of course, fraud isn't the only thing he needs to watch out for. The most obvious thing is that the people who claim they're hearing these voices are deluding themselves.
Are deluding themselves. That's correct. Imagining something on the radio, through the hiss.
Projecting their own thoughts onto the static sounds or random noises.
And I have a feeling that happens, and I suspect that it happens more often than not. That's why we're looking at professionals like Cardoso at the cream of the crop.
Yeah, because when you've got 10,000 amateurs working in this area, well, you're going to get a lot of noise.
And we do.
But Fontana observed some of the two-way communications.
He did indeed, and that's hard to explain away. And if you're watching Cardoso communicate with the spirit, and some of the voices are clearer than others, some are quite clear, she claims, and there he is looking on, assessing, and concluding that everything she claims is in fact legitimate.
That the voices are very clearly responding to her.
Very clearly responding to her. Keep in mind that he, at the time, was the leading British parapsychologist alive. He died in 2010, by the way. So that's about as good a support as we can find, Jeff.
Well, I think it's certainly enough for people to want to take a second look
Absolutely.
at this kind of phenomenon.
Absolutely.
I know it's widely reported on the various channels, the ghost hunter kind of channels.
Right.
It's gotten, there's sort of this big subculture, and frankly, some of the things that I see when I watch those channels, they're puzzling. You can hear voices that are saying words and phrases that are recognizable in English.
Right. It just is. It's done so unscientifically. It's done with that weird music, and it just invites all kinds of disgrace by itself. It is. They may be under
it's probably
really
the
good.
very thing that makes it hard for a scholar such as yourself to pursue this in an academic context.
Right. It does. I have to read the really good literature, or I'm not going to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to find, once I started looking into it, how much really solid literature there is out there. This is a very real phenomenon worth taking seriously. And ITC, It's interesting also, Jeff, that Cardoso's spirits and other spirits have told us that the world in which they live is very much like the world that is described by mediums in the classical mediumistic literature.
The spiritualist literature.
Right. It's extremely similar. For example, that they do have bodies over there, that there is a real world over there where they live, that we are placed on the earth to be challenged so that we will grow our souls. All of this stuff that I wrote about in my first 2 books on mediumship has been supported by these voices.
A consistency there.
Very consistent.
Yeah.
Jeff, the thing that is discouraging about this is that the wording and the way the words come to us from these ITC sources is a bit disappointing. They obviously, on the other side, have not mastered the technique to get through their full message. And Cardoso is convinced of that, that we're only getting a small segment of it. She says that it sounds as if there has been a kind of a rhythmic, unnatural crushing together of thoughts, rapid speech that's just not natural. And she says furthermore that every now and then she overhears them speaking to each other. For example, they might say, "Oh, it's Annabelle come back to bother us again." All right, and when they speak to each other, they speak in a very normal voice. But when they start to speak to her, it sounds strange and unnatural. And she says it sounds very labored, as if there's a technology over there that they have not mastered yet either.
Well, if that's the case, if it's technology on both ends, then
there's hope.
That we would expect to see improvements over time.
And that is exactly what some of my friends who are working in this area are just chafing at the bit to try to make it better. They're convinced that they can make very clear communication within a year. They always fail, by the way. And Cardoso wonders if perhaps we're simply not meant to make an open and shut case for the reality of the afterlife and for its nature. Maybe it's just not meant to be. Maybe the Creator didn't intend this. Who knows?
Well, Stafford, Betty, what an interesting adventure to share with you.
Been delightful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.